Okay, guys, this is your second and final lesson on World War I. Now, one of the most important things that you have to remember about World War I is the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Espionage is basically a fancy way of saying spying, and sedition, an act of sedition, is like being a traitor to your country, right? Engaging in some kind of treasonous activity. Anyway, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed during World War I. And these laws were designed to protect the country during a period of war by limiting or reducing people's civil liberties. That's like another way of saying your civil rights, the freedoms that you get from the Bill of Rights. So, for example, your rights to free speech or free press, free assembly, things like that. And you can see the poster on the left. Loose lips might sink ships. The idea of loose lips, that means what you're saying, right? You're talking, you're moving your lips, that your talk things that you say might hurt the war effort and might hurt the military, all right? And that's the idea behind the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And this is an issue that has gone on throughout history, all right, both before this and will continue after. And that's the idea of this trade-off between freedom and security. Think about your parents, right? You tell your parents, hey, mom, dad, I want to go to my friend's house. Let's say it's 11 o'clock at night. And you say, hey, I want to go walk to my friend's house. And your parents have to make a decision. Do they give you more freedom and say, all right, go, you're an older, go out at night and go see your friend? Or are they going to say, oh, no, you're going to stay in the house? Because if you stay in the house, I can keep you safe, right? What's the trade-off? So you might say, well, 11 p.m., I want to keep you safe. But, should they lock you in the house at 5 p.m.? Should they give you the freedom to go by yourself somewhere at 5 p.m.? Or should they keep you more safe and not let you leave the house? That's the trade-off. It's a trade-off. But this is the same kind of idea that governments face. Do you allow people to have lots and lots of freedom, or do you reduce freedom in an effort to keep them more safe? So the Espionage and Sedition Acts are designed to limit citizens' freedom, but the trade-off is it would keep our military stronger, it would keep our country safe during World War I. And again, this is not the first time we've seen this issue of this kind of trade-off. We've seen this when one of our presidents, remember, he suspended habeas corpus. Do you remember who I'm talking about? What president eliminated habeas corpus? Well, that was Abraham Lincoln, right? He did that in 1861 during the Civil War. The idea was, if you remember, in the border states, there was a lot of rebellion going on. People were attacking the armies, and you had politicians who were urging people to not join the draft. And so, as a result, Abraham Lincoln reduced people's civil rights. He took away people's freedom of speech or freedom of the press. He took away habeas corpus to make the country more safe during the Civil War. We've also seen something very similar to the Espionage and Sedition Act at the very start of U.S. history. It was actually during the presidency of John Adams. He's one of the first presidents in the 1700s. And he had passed an act, if you remember the political cartoon with the snake eating the children. Do you remember that? Remember this? This was the Alien and Sedition Acts. This happened in 1798. Now, during that period, we weren't at war, but we were in some hostilities with France. So President Adams had passed the Alien and Sedition Act, and there was a huge outcry against them. You remember that these sedition bills had the effect of hurting free press and free speech. And people said, this isn't right, that, we're a country of freedom and you can't limit people's civil rights. So this kind of trade-off between freedom and safety has been going on for a while. But during World War I, this issue came before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is asked to decide, can the government limit people's freedoms in a time, of war in order to keep us more safe? And the Supreme Court found the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Supreme Court upheld them. They said these laws are constitutional. The government does have the right to limit your freedoms. This was the case where this came before the Supreme Court was Shank versus United States. This is a very important Supreme Court case. It always comes up on the region, so make sure you memorize this name. Shank versus United States was a case where the defendant had sent out flyers basically telling people don't go join the draft, don't join the army, and so the defendant was found in violation of the Alien Sedition Acts. And in a unanimous decision, that means every single Supreme Court judge agreed that the defendants were guilty, and they said the Alien Sedition Acts were constitutional. And the argument was that your civil rights, your civil liberties, okay, those rights that you have under the Bill of Rights, those can be limited during a national emergency. So to keep you safe, we can make you a little less free. And as far as like what's going to determine whether or not it's constitutional, the measure that they use is clear and present danger. That's the standard. So Shank versus United States says if something you say or do, it presents a clear and present danger. If your free speech, if your right to free speech, if your speech presents a clear and present danger to the country, it can be limited. The government has the right to limit your free speech. Your First Amendment right to free speech can be limited during a national emergency if it presents a clear and present danger. So please know Shank versus United States. All right. The other big thing to come out of World War I is, and for those of you who had global already, this is going to sound familiar. This was a war. Again, World War I happens in Europe, and France and England were fighting with Germany. Remember, there was trench warfare. Very, very bloody, long war, killed a lot of people. Remember, the United States, though, we came into this war at the very last minute. I mean, we only fought for like 2 years and we were done. But this war had been going on for a really long time. And so when it's time to create a peace treaty, okay, which is known as the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles is the one that's going to end World War I. Remember that the United States was kind of urging for peace. The United States wants everybody in Europe to get along, to find peace. And part of that was President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president, makes a speech. And this speech is known as the 14-point speech. You have to know this. And in this speech, he says he urges a new world order and new rules for how people should treat each other in a way that will ensure peace, long-term peace in Europe. And so these points on the left, things like diplomacy and freedom of the seas, and you can see about how, certain borders with different countries and who should be in charge and blah, blah, blah. But, and again, this is very idealistic because, of course, the U.S. wanted peace. Now, for those of you who had global, you know that this is not what happens. That instead of really urging peace and creating a Treaty of Versailles that was very fair and nice to Germany, what ends up happening is they come out with the Treaty of Versailles ends up punishing Germany very, very harshly for World War I. The terms of the treaty are very, very harsh. They do not listen to Woodrow Wilson. They ignore Woodrow Wilson's recommendations, okay? However, there is one thing in Woodrow Wilson's speech that the European nations, that England and France, do agree to. And what they agree to is this number 14, the creation of an association of nations. What happens is Woodrow Wilson had said, listen, instead of going to war, we should create a League of Nations where everyone can talk through their problems. And instead of going to war, you're able to meet at the League, we're able to negotiate, we're able to discuss issues and resolve them instead of going to war. So like I said, most of his speech was ignored, but this piece, they say, all right, we will create a League of Nations. So the Europeans agree, they create a League of Nations. But even though Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, is the guy who came up with the idea of a League of Nations. Even though it was his idea, the United States does not join. We are not a member of the League of Nations. We refuse to join. And why? Well, it's because the President of the United States has the authority and the right to negotiate treaties. The treaties that the President comes up with must be approved by Congress. So Woodrow Wilson negotiates the Treaty of Versailles and includes, includes in it that the U.S. would join this League of Nations, but the Senate doesn't approve the treaty. All right. And to understand it, the kind of implications of that, we should look at some political cartoons. This political cartoon has come up on the Regents a number of times. Okay, it's pretty famous. It's the gap in the bridge. That's what it says on the bottom. And you can see on the left, there's a sign. It says, "This League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the United States." So this is the idea that Woodrow Wilson had come up with the idea for the League of Nations, right? This league, this meeting place where all the nations of Europe would come together and be able to talk. And as you can see, it lists all these leagues. So this is the bridge. But if you notice, there's a big space. There's a gap, right? There's that space in the bridge because there's something missing. And what's missing from the League of Nations? Well, you look at Uncle Sam, and what's he leaning against? He's leaning against the keystone, which is the USA. The USA does not join the League of Nations. And because the USA doesn't join, you don't have a functional bridge. The bridge will be weak. The bridge will collapse. The bridge won't work. You need that missing piece, okay? And that's the idea, that because the U.S. does not join the League of Nations, basically the League of Nations is doomed to failure because we are not part of it. All right. So then the idea is, well, why didn't we join? Why didn't we join? Well, let's take a look at this political cartoon. And first, you have to, what's going on in the cartoon? Well, two people are getting married, right? And you should recognize the groom, okay? The groom is Uncle Sam. Whenever you have a white-haired man with the beard, and if you look at his pants, he's got those striped pants, right, that look like the flag. So that's always Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam is getting married, and the bride, her dress, if you see in the orange arrow, her dress is labeled Foreign Entanglements. So the idea is Uncle Sam would get married, would now be involved with foreign wars, with European wars. And what would bring Uncle Sam and get him involved in foreign wars? Well, look at the little priest. The priest is holding League of Nations. The idea is that if Uncle Sam joins the League of Nations, it's going to involve him in foreign wars. And you see peace proceedings because that was part of the negotiations with the Treaty of Versailles. Okay? And so we're at the point of the wedding, very famous part, where the priest will say, and this is what the thing is, if any man can show just cause why they shall not be lawfully joined together, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Have you ever seen that, right? Two people get married and they say, hey, if you can think of a reason why these two shouldn't be joined in matrimony, speak now or hold your peace. And that's the idea. If you think there's something wrong with this wedding, if there's a reason why this husband and this wife should not be married, you got to speak up or it's going to go forward. And so lo and behold, as these two are about to get married, who busts in to break up the ceremony? The U.S. Senate. And you can see the U.S. Senate is there and it's holding up its constitutional rights because, of course, the U.S. Senate has the constitutional right to approve treaties. So the U.S. Senate says, stop right there, Uncle Sam. You are not going to get involved and marry into foreign entanglements. You're not going to join the League of Nations. This isn't going to happen. The U.S. Senate stops it. And why? So the U.S. Senate is the one to interrupt the ceremony. That's where the name of the political cartoons comes in. The U.S. Senate is going to stop this ceremony. And why? Because the United States wants to maintain a policy of neutrality, right? that had always been. This is this idea of the U.S. staying out of European affairs. This has been our foreign policy since George Washington, if you remember. That was his farewell address where he had said the U.S. needs to stay neutral. We're not going to get involved in European affairs. Remember, our only focus was the Western Hemisphere, right? We care about America. We care about Latin America. That's it. We're not involved in foreign wars. And so this is actually this idea of, World War I is like a blip. It's like a temporary thing. We want to stay out of European affairs, but we had kind of temporarily okay, fine, we'll fight in World War I, but we're going right back. Like this was an exception. We want to go back to normal. And that's actually, you can see President Harding, he actually runs on this slogan of a return to normalcy, that the United States being involved in these European wars is not normal for us. We don't want this. We do not want to be part of European affairs. We want to return to normal, return to our policy of isolationism, return to our policy of neutrality. We're going to go back to that. And we do not join the League of Nations. In keeping with that, we don't join the League of Nations, and therefore the League of Nations will fail. In fact, we go even beyond that. We want to make sure the joining into World War I, that a lot of people in America never want to see us go into one of these foreign wars again. So they want to prevent it. So some of the reasons, what happens is you end up passing what's called the Neutrality Acts. Okay, again, these are laws. Acts means laws. So neutrality, to keep us neutral, to keep us out of these wars. So the idea is if you remember, one of the big reasons why the U.S. got pulled into World War I, right? The big reason was the sinking of the Lusitania, right? And the fact that the United States had trading relationships with Britain and France. That was why we were kind of on the side of the Allies even before we joined, because we had trading relations with them, and Americans were traveling on British ships. That's why when the Lusitania, a British ship, was sunk by German submarines, that was one of the reasons. That's one of the things that pulled us into the war. So that's why with the Neutrality Acts, they want to prevent that from happening. So, for example, if the nation is at war, you can't loan them money. You can't sell them weapons. And U.S. citizens can't even travel on ships that belong to anything. So that's the idea. The Neutrality Acts are kind of designed to prevent the U.S. from ever getting involved in European wars again. The only other thing I'm going to talk about really quickly is, like I said, the president is Harding. One of the things, in addition to this kind of return to normalcy, what he's really known for is the Teapot Dome scandal. You just have to be aware of it. Long story short, it's an example of a scandal basically in this one, Harding had gotten his poker buddies, basically his friends from Ohio. They had worked in his administration, and they got caught doing very nasty, illegal things. As you can see, the Secretary of the Interior ended up leasing government land to an oil company in exchange for basically a bribe. Okay, and this terrible corruption ends up, it's basically a black mark against Harding. But anyway, long story short, although a couple people got charged with crimes and got into serious trouble, Harding was able to, he stayed out of it. They basically said it was his administration. He didn't get charged, but he dies in office anyway, and you have a new president takes after him, is Calvin Coolidge. So the main thing you need to know is the Teapot Dome scandal. You just need to know this is an example of government corruption. This is where people in the administration are kind of caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Okay, with that, we are done with World War I.